In the autumn of 1948, Bogdan Petrescu was 22 years old and studying philosophy at the University of Bucharest. He came from a modest family in Transylvania, his father a schoolteacher, his mother a seamstress. He had grown up with books, with conversations about ideas, with the belief that education was the path to a better life. When the communists seized power in Romania that year, Bogdan did what many students did. He joined a discussion group. They met in cafes and dormitories, talking about democracy, about the future, about resistance. They were careful. They spoke in whispers. They avoided names. But in a country where the secret police, the Securitate, had informants everywhere, careful was never enough. On a cold morning in January 1949, 3 men in dark coats knocked on the door of Bogdan's apartment. They did not say what he had done. They did not show a warrant. They simply told him to come with them. His mother tried to follow. They pushed her back and closed the door. Bogdan was driven to a building with no sign, led down a corridor with no windows, and locked in a room with no explanation. He would not see his family again for 4 years. The interrogations began immediately. A man in a uniform sat across from him and asked who else attended the meetings. Bogdan said he didn't know what they were talking about. The man slapped him. Not hard, just enough to make the point clear. "We already know," the man said calmly. "We just want to hear you say it." Bogdan stayed silent. The next interrogation lasted 6 hours. The one after that, 12. They didn't beat him severely, not yet. They just wore him down with repetition, with sleep deprivation, with the understanding that this would not end until he gave them something. After 2 weeks, Bogdan signed a confession. He didn't know most of the names they put in front of him, but he signed anyway. It didn't matter. The confession was a formality. By then, they had already decided where he would go. In March 1949, Bogdan was transferred to Pitești Prison, a facility 2 hours west of Bucharest, built in the 1800s and repurposed by the communists for political prisoners. He arrived in a transport truck with 20 other men, all around his age, all accused of similar crimes, belonging to student organizations, reading banned books, discussing ideas the state considered dangerous. They were called enemies of the people. Most were students, some were priests, a few were former politicians. None of them were criminals in the traditional sense. They were simply people who had believed in something other than communism. The prison itself looked ordinary from the outside. Grey stone walls, barred windows, a guard tower at each corner. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The corridors smelled of mold and sweat. Bogdan was assigned to a cell with 15 other men. There were no beds, just a concrete floor. At night, they slept pressed against one another for warmth. For the first few weeks, Bogdan thought this was simply prison. Hard, uncomfortable, degrading, but survivable. He had no idea what was about to begin. In April, a new officer arrived at Pitesti. His name was Eugen Turcanu, and he was a prisoner, not a guard. Turcanu had been a student himself before his arrest. He was intelligent, charismatic, and calculating. And at some point during his interrogation, he had made a deal with the Securitate. He would help them break the other prisoners. In exchange, he would receive privileges, better food, a private cell, and the promise of early release. What the Securitate wanted was not just confessions. They wanted something deeper, re-education. They wanted to strip prisoners of their beliefs, their identities, their humanity, and rebuild them as loyal communists. Turcanu would be the architect of that process, and Bogdan Petrescu would be one of his subjects. The process began with a meeting. Turcanu gathered the prisoners in a large room and explained that they were part of a new program. "It was voluntary," he said. "Those who participated would be treated better. Those who refused would remain in the general population." It sounded reasonable. A few prisoners volunteered immediately, hoping for better conditions. Bogdan hesitated, but eventually he raised his hand. He thought it might be lectures, political classes, something tedious but harmless. He was wrong. The first session began the next morning. Țurcanu stood at the front of the room and asked the prisoners to confess their inner thoughts, the doubts, fears, and beliefs they had hidden during interrogation. At first, the confessions were vague. Men admitted to missing their families, to questioning communist doctrine, to praying in secret. Țurcanu listened patiently. Then he said something that made the room go silent. "Your confessions are not enough. You are lying to yourselves, and we will help you tell the truth." He gestured to two other prisoners, men who had been part of the program longer. They walked over to a young man who had just confessed to praying, and they began to beat him, not with weapons, with their fists, with their boots, while Țurcanu watched and gave instructions. "Harder. He needs to understand that God will not save him. Only we can." The beating continued until the young man collapsed. Then Țurcanu turned to the rest of the group. "This is how you unmake a man," he said quietly. "You take away everything he believes in, and then you rebuild him." Bogdan sat frozen, his hands trembling. He had thought this was prison. He was realizing now it was something far worse. The program at Pitești was not random violence. It was systematic, calculated, a process designed to destroy the human mind and replace it with something obedient. Țurcanu called it unmasking. The goal was to force prisoners to confess not just their actions, but their deepest beliefs, and then to reject those beliefs publicly, violently, and completely. The process had stages. Stage 1. External unmasking. Prisoners were forced to confess everything they had ever believed: religious faith, political ideologies, family loyalties. If a man said he believed in God, he was beaten until he denounced God. If he said he loved his mother, he was beaten until he cursed her name. If he hesitated, the beatings intensified. Țurcanu did not do most of the beating himself. He assigned it to other prisoners, men who had already been broken and were now trying to prove their loyalty by brutalizing the newcomers. Bogdan watched as men he had known for weeks turned into torturers overnight, not because they wanted to, but because refusing meant becoming the next victim. Stage 2. Internal unmasking. Once a prisoner had confessed and denounced his beliefs, the second stage began. He had to prove his transformation by torturing others. This was the cruelest part of the system, because it wasn't enough to survive. You had to become complicit. Bogdan saw men who had been beaten unconscious one day, beating others the next, their faces blank, their hands shaking. But they did it anyway, because the alternative was to be sent back to stage 1. The system created a cycle. Victim becomes perpetrator. Perpetrator creates new victims. And Țurcanu watched it all with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Stage 3. Public degradation. The final stage was designed to break whatever remained of a prisoner's dignity. Men were forced to mock their own religions. Priests were made to urinate on crosses. Students were forced to blaspheme in front of the group. Believers were made to spit on icons while others watched and laughed. Some prisoners broke completely. They sat in corners, rocking back and forth, no longer responding to commands. Others adapted. They learned to perform the rituals mechanically, disconnecting their minds from their actions. And a few, like Țurcanu's inner circle, embraced it. They became true believers in the process, convinced they were creating a new kind of human being. Bogdan entered stage 1 in May 1949. The first time they beat him, he tried to resist. He clenched his fists, set his jaw, and told himself he would not break. But resistance only made it worse. They beat him for hours. 2 men held his arms while a third struck his ribs, his back, his legs. When he fell, they kicked him. When he tried to curl into a ball, they pulled him upright and started again. Turcanu stood nearby, watching. "You think you are strong," he said calmly. "You think your beliefs will protect you. But beliefs are just thoughts, and thoughts can be erased." After 6 hours, Bogdan confessed everything they asked. He denounced his family. He denounced his faith. He denounced ideas he had once considered sacred. And when he finished, Turcanu smiled. "Good. Now you are ready for stage 2. The next morning, Bogdan was told to beat another prisoner, a man he had shared a cell with, a man who had prayed quietly every night before sleep. Bogdan refused. They beat him again. Harder this time. Longer. When they stopped, Turcanu leaned close and whispered, "You will do this, or we will do this to you every day until you die. The choice is yours." That night, Bogdan could not sleep. He lay on the cold floor, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a way out that did not exist. By morning, he had made his decision. He would survive, no matter what it cost. The first time Bogdan struck another prisoner, his hands shook so violently he could barely make a fist. The man, a priest in his 40s, knelt on the floor, already bruised from previous beatings. He looked up at Bogdan with an expression that was not anger, but pity. "Do what you must," the priest said quietly. Bogdan closed his eyes and swung. The sound of his fist connecting with the man's face made him flinch. But he didn't stop, because if he stopped, he would be next. Afterward, Bogdan sat in the corner of the cell and vomited, but Turcanu was pleased. "You are learning," he said. Over the following months, Bogdan descended through the stages. He beat men who begged him to stop. He mocked beliefs he had once held sacred. He participated in degradations that left him hollow. And slowly, so slowly he didn't notice it happening, something inside him changed. Not because he believed in communism, but because believing in anything required a part of him that no longer existed. He had become what the system wanted, a blank slate, responsive to commands, incapable of resistance, a man without a self. By the winter of 1950, Bogdan Petrescu no longer resembled the student who had entered Pitești. His body had thinned from malnutrition. His hands bore scars from the beatings, both those he had received and those he had given. His eyes, once sharp and questioning, now moved slowly, tracking movement without curiosity. He had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Speak when spoken to. Obey without hesitation. Show no emotion that could be interpreted as resistance. The program at Pitesti had stripped him of his beliefs, his dignity, and his sense of self. What remained was a man who functioned but barely. And yet, even in that emptiness, something still flickered, a small, stubborn part of him that remembered who he had been. That part would be the hardest to destroy. And Turcanu knew it. The breaking point came in February 1951. Turcanu announced that the program was entering a new phase. The prisoners who had survived the first stages would now prove their loyalty in a final test. They would torture their closest friends, not strangers, not men they had met weeks ago. The people they had survived with, the ones who had shared their rations, who had whispered encouragement in the dark, who had kept them sane. Bogdan had formed such a bond with a man named Alexandru, a former teacher, arrested for the same vague crime of anti-communist sentiment. Alexandru had been kind in the early days, sharing what little food he had, offering quiet reassurance when Bogdan thought he would break. They had not spoken much in recent months. Survival left little room for friendship, but the bond remained. When Turcanu called Bogdan's name and pointed to Alexandru, Bogdan's stomach turned. "Prove that you are no longer weak," Turcanu said. "Show us that sentiment is a disease you have cured." Alexandru knelt on the floor. He did not plead. He did not look at Bogdan with anger. He simply closed his eyes and waited. Bogdan stood frozen. This was different. Every other time, he had been able to tell himself he was just trying to survive, that the men he hurt were strangers, that they would have done the same to him. But Alexandru was not a stranger, and Turcanu knew that. "Do it," Turcanu said quietly, "or we will assume you are still infected with bourgeois sentimentality. And you know what happens then." Bogdan's hands trembled. His breath came shallow and fast. He thought about refusing, about telling Turcanu that this was where he would draw the line. But he had learned something in the months at Pitești. There were no lines. Every boundary he thought he had, the system found and erased. If he refused, they would beat him until he complied. Or they would kill him. And either way, Alexandru would still be tortured, just by someone else. The logic was suffocating, inevitable. Bogdan raised his fist. He did not remember most of what happened next. His mind disconnected, the way it had learned to do during the worst moments. He was present, but not present. His body moved through the motions, while his consciousness retreated somewhere unreachable. When it was over, Alexandru lay unconscious on the floor. Bogdan's hands were bloody, and Turcanu was smiling. "Good," he said. "Now you are ready." That night, Bogdan sat in the corner of his cell and stared at his hands. He tried to feel something, guilt, rage, sorrow, anything. But there was nothing. The part of him that could feel had been carved out so methodically, so completely, that even grief was beyond his reach. He had survived Pitesti, but he was no longer Bogdan Petrescu. He was something else, something the system had created. By the spring of 1951, Bogdan had been fully absorbed into Turcanu's inner circle. He no longer needed to be commanded. He anticipated what was expected and did it without hesitation. He tortured new prisoners with the same detachment he had once reserved for studying philosophy. He watched men break and felt nothing. He had become, in the language of the program, re-educated. But re-education was a euphemism. What had happened at Pitești was not education. It was the systematic destruction of the human psyche, followed by the construction of something obedient and empty. Bogdan had not been taught to believe in communism. He had been taught that belief itself was dangerous, that identity was a weakness, that survival required becoming nothing. And in that nothingness, he functioned. In May 1951, a new prisoner arrived, a young man, barely 20, with the same wide-eyed fear Bogdan had once carried. Turcanu assigned Bogdan to oversee the young man's unmasking. Bogdan looked at the boy and saw himself 2 years earlier. The same hope that things would not be as bad as they seemed, the same belief that he could endure without losing himself. For a brief moment, something stirred in Bogdan, an impulse to warn the boy, to tell him there was no enduring this, only surrender. But the moment passed, because warning him would be pointless, and because Bogdan no longer had the capacity for mercy. He began the process the way Turcanu had taught him, calmly, methodically, without emotion. And the boy, like so many before him, broke. Pitești Prison was not the only site of re-education experiments in Romania, but it was the most extreme. Between 1949 and 1952, the program processed hundreds of prisoners, mostly students, priests, intellectuals, and former politicians. The system was not improvised. It was designed, refined, and executed with bureaucratic precision. And it worked. The architects of the Pitești Experiment understood something fundamental about human psychology. Identity is fragile. Strip away a person's beliefs, their relationships, their sense of dignity, and what remains is remarkably malleable. The program did not rely on physical torture alone, though that was central. It relied on something more insidious, forcing victims to become perpetrators. This created a psychological trap. If you tortured someone, you could tell yourself you were just trying to survive, that you had no choice, that anyone would have done the same. But the act still changed you, because once you crossed that line, you could not return to who you had been before. The system knew this, and it exploited it. The process was overseen by a small group of Securitate officers, but the day-to-day operations were carried out almost entirely by prisoners. This was not an accident. It saved resources, it created complicity, and it ensured that even if the program was eventually exposed, the government could claim it was a prisoner-led initiative, not an official policy. Tărcanu and his inner circle received privileges: better food, private cells, occasional visits from family. These rewards were carefully calibrated, enough to create loyalty, not enough to make them comfortable. They were tools, and they knew it. But they also knew that being a tool was better than being a victim. The methods used at Pitești were documented in excruciating detail by survivors. Physical torture, beatings with fists, boots, and improvised weapons. Sleep deprivation, prisoners kept awake for days. Starvation, rations reduced until compliance increased. Forced stress positions, kneeling, standing for hours. Psychological torture, forced confessions of private thoughts, public denunciations of family members, ritual humiliation, prisoners forced to perform degrading acts, peer-on-peer violence, victims forced to torture each other, spiritual torture, religious prisoners forced to desecrate icons, priests made to blaspheme publicly, believers forced to participate in mock religious ceremonies designed to humiliate. The combination was devastating. Men who could withstand physical pain broke when forced to betray their beliefs. Men who could endure isolation broke when forced to harm others. The system targeted every pillar of identity and dismantled them one by one. Records suggest that of the several hundred prisoners who went through the program, most emerged fundamentally changed. Some became collaborators, continuing to work with the Securitate after their release. Others withdrew completely, incapable of reintegrating into society. A few resisted the process and died, either from the beatings or from starvation. And a small number survived by learning to dissociate so completely that they could perform the required actions without internalizing them. But even those survivors carried the scars. Bogdan fell into the last category. He learned to split himself into two people, the one who acted and the one who observed from a distance. The observer watched as his hands beat other prisoners, watched as his voice recited the required denunciations, watched as his body moved through the rituals of re-education. But the observer did not participate. It simply recorded. This dissociation allowed him to survive without fully becoming what the system wanted him to be. But it also meant that he was never fully present, not at Pitești, and not in the years that followed. He had learned to survive by becoming a ghost in his own life. The program at Pitești ended in 1952, not because anyone in power decided it was wrong, but because it was no longer useful. By then, the Communist Party had consolidated control. The need for extreme re-education had diminished. Simpler methods, imprisonment, forced labor, execution, were sufficient to manage dissent. Tărcanu and several members of his inner circle were quietly arrested, not for the torture, but for exceeding their authority. It was a bureaucratic distinction. The state needed someone to blame, and Tărcanu, despite his loyalty, was expendable. He was tried, convicted, and executed in December 1954. The other prisoners were released, sent to labor camps, or transferred to other facilities. Bogdan was among those released in 1953. He walked out of Pitești Prison after 4 years, 20 pounds lighter, with scars on his hands and a mind that no longer functioned the way it had before. He returned to Bucharest. His mother wept when she saw him. His father asked what had happened. Bogdan said nothing, because there were no words for what he had lived through, and because admitting what he had done, what he had become, would have broken what little remained of him. For decades, Romania did not speak about Pitesti, not officially, not publicly, not in any way that might force the country to confront what had happened inside those walls. The survivors carried the silence with them, some because they were ashamed, others because they were afraid, many because they simply could not find the words, and the state, which had orchestrated the program, ensured that silence was maintained through intimidation, censorship, and the erasure of records. When Bogdan returned to Bucharest in 1953, he tried to resume his life. He could not return to university. Former political prisoners were barred from higher education. He could not discuss what had happened. Doing so would mark him as a dissident and invite further persecution. He took a job in a factory where he worked without speaking, without forming friendships, without attracting attention. His mother noticed that he flinched when someone raised their voice, that he no longer went to church, that he slept poorly, waking in the night with his fists clenched. She asked him once what they had done to him. He looked at her with eyes that no longer held light and said, "Nothing I can explain." She did not ask again. Other survivors faced similar fates. Some were rearrested on fabricated charges, the state's way of ensuring they would not speak. Others disappeared into labor camps, where they worked until their bodies gave out. A few attempted suicide. Some succeeded. Those who managed to reintegrate into society did so by burying their experiences so deeply that even they could not access them without triggering psychological collapse. One survivor, interviewed decades later, described it this way: "You learn to live in two times. The time before Pitesti, which feels like a dream, and the time after, which feels like waking up in someone else's life. You never fully return to the first. You never fully accept the second. You just exist in between." The Romanian government maintained its silence through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Official records of the Pitesti program were destroyed or buried in classified archives. Survivors who tried to speak publicly were harassed, arrested, or threatened. The Communist Party's position was simple: the program had never happened. Any claims otherwise were Western propaganda designed to discredit Romania. And for decades the world believed them, or simply didn't care. The first cracks in the silence appeared in the 1970s, when a few survivors managed to flee Romania and speak to Western journalists. Their testimonies were shocking, detailed, consistent. But even then the story struggled to gain traction. The Cold War was at its height. Western governments were reluctant to publicize communist atrocities that might complicate diplomatic relations. Media outlets were skeptical. The claims seemed too extreme to be believable, and the survivors themselves were often dismissed as traumatized, unreliable, or politically motivated. One survivor, asked why he thought no one believed him, said simply, "Because what happened at Pitești requires accepting that human beings are capable of things most people would rather pretend are impossible." Inside Romania, the silence was enforced not just by the state, but by the survivors themselves. Many of those who had been victims at Pitești had also become perpetrators. They carried guilt that was unbearable to articulate. Some justified their actions by telling themselves they had no choice. Others convinced themselves that the torture had been necessary, that the end justified the means. But most simply tried to forget, because remembering meant confronting not just what had been done to them, but what they had done to others. And that was a truth too painful to bear. Bogdan never spoke about Pitesti to anyone outside his immediate family. When Romania's communist regime finally fell in 1989, journalists sought out survivors, hoping to document the program for the first time. A reporter found Bogdan living in a small apartment in Bucharest. He was in his 60s by then, grey-haired and thin, with hands that trembled when he held a cup of tea. The reporter asked if he would be willing to share his story. Bogdan stared at the table for a long time. Then he said, "What would you like me to say? That I was a victim? That I was a hero? I was neither. I was a man who survived by becoming something I can no longer recognize. There is no story in that. Only shame." The reporter pressed. Bogdan stood up and asked him to leave. He never gave another interview. The silence around Pitesti was not unique. It followed the same pattern as other atrocities hidden for decades: complicity, shame, and a collective decision that forgetting was easier than reckoning. But silence does not erase history. It only delays the moment when that history must be confronted. And for Romania, that moment was coming. The fall of communism in 1989 opened Romania's archives for the first time in 40 years. Journalists, historians, and survivors began piecing together the full scope of the Pitești Experiment. What they found was more extensive and more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Declassified Securitate documents revealed that the program had been authorized at the highest levels of government. It was not a rogue operation. It was official policy. The goal, according to internal memos, was to develop a method of rapid ideological conversion that could be applied to political prisoners across the country. Pitesti was the pilot program. If it succeeded, similar methods would be implemented nationwide. The documents included directives from Securitate leadership approving the program, reports from officers monitoring progress, lists of prisoners selected for re-education, descriptions of successful conversions. These records confirmed what survivors had said for decades: the torture was systematic, sanctioned, and scientifically designed to break human minds. Survivor testimonies began to emerge publicly. Men in their 60s and 70s, many of whom had never spoken about their experiences, agreed to be interviewed. Their accounts were remarkably consistent: the stages of unmasking, the forced participation in torture, the psychological techniques designed to erase identity, the transformation of victims into perpetrators. One survivor described it this way: "They didn't just want to break us. They wanted to turn us into their tools. And the worst part is, it worked. I became exactly what they wanted. And I have spent every day since trying to undo what they made me." In 1993, the Romanian government established a commission to investigate communist-era abuses. Pitesti was among the cases examined. The commission's report, published in 1997, confirmed the survivor testimonies and provided the first official acknowledgement that the program had occurred. The report concluded: the Pitesti Experiment constituted crimes against humanity. The program was sanctioned by the Communist Party leadership. Hundreds of prisoners were subjected to systematic torture. Many survivors were left with permanent psychological damage. But the report stopped short of individual accountability. Most of the officials who had authorized the program were dead. Țurcanu, the program's primary executor, had been executed decades earlier. And the survivors who had participated as perpetrators were classified as victims under the law, their actions deemed coerced. No one was prosecuted. The exposure of Pitesti sparked a national debate in Romania. Some argued that the survivors who had become torturers should be held accountable, that coercion was not an excuse for participation in atrocity. Others argued that they had been victims twice over, first of the torture, then of the system that forced them to perpetrate it. The debate was never resolved, and for many survivors the exposure brought not closure, but a new kind of suffering. Because now their stories were public, their shame was public, their complicity was public, and the question they had spent decades avoiding, what does it mean to survive by becoming a monster, could no longer be ignored. Bogdan Petrescu died in 2001, 12 years after the fall of communism. His death was not widely noted. A small obituary appeared in a local newspaper, mentioning only that he had been a factory worker and a survivor of political imprisonment. It did not mention Pitesti. It did not mention the 4 years he had spent inside a system designed to erase him. It did not mention the choices he had made, or the cost of those choices. It said simply, he survived. And perhaps that was the only truth that mattered. But survival, as Bogdan had learned, was not the same as living. And the silence he carried with him to the grave was the price he paid for enduring what no person should have to endure. One of the most difficult questions raised by Pitesti is this: what do you do with perpetrators who were also victims? Men who were tortured, and then became torturers. Men who suffered, and then inflicted suffering. Men who had their identities destroyed, and then destroyed others. The answer is not simple, and Romania never fully confronted it. Eugen Turcanu, the architect of the Pitesti program, was executed in 1954, but his execution was not for the torture itself. It was for exceeding his authority, a bureaucratic charge designed to distance the state from his actions. The Communist Party could not admit that Turcanu had been following orders, because that would implicate the entire system. So they sacrificed him, framing him as a rogue actor who had taken a sanctioned program too far. It was a lie, but it was a convenient lie, and it allowed the state to maintain the fiction that Pitesti had been an aberration, not official policy. The other members of Turcanu's inner circle faced varying fates. Some were rearrested and sent to labor camps. Others were quietly released and disappeared into society, their pasts erased from official records. A few attempted to rebuild their lives under new identities. But most carried the weight of what they had done in silence, unable to speak about it, unable to escape it. One former participant, interviewed in the 1990s, described the psychological toll. I tell myself I had no choice. I tell myself I was a victim too, and both of those things are true. But they do not erase what I did. They do not bring back the men I hurt. I survived Pitești, but I did not survive intact. None of us did. The question of accountability was complicated further by the nature of the program itself. Pitesti was designed to blur the line between victim and perpetrator. Prisoners were not simply coerced into violence. They were systematically conditioned to believe that their survival depended on it. They were stripped of agency, then forced to act. They were dehumanized, then made to dehumanize others. The system created perpetrators by design, and that raises a question no legal or moral framework can easily answer. When does coercion absolve responsibility? And when does participation, even under duress, constitute complicity? Some survivors argued that every prisoner who participated, no matter the circumstances, bore responsibility. We all had a choice, one survivor said. The choice was between our humanity and our survival. Many of us chose survival. That doesn't make us innocent. Others disagreed. There was no choice. Another survivor said, not in any meaningful sense. You cannot choose when your mind has been systematically dismantled. You can only react, and the system controlled those reactions. Both perspectives carry truth, and both leave the same uncomfortable reality. The perpetrators of Pitesti were also its victims, and accountability in such cases is almost impossible to assign. The Romanian government's decision not to prosecute survivors who had participated as torturers was pragmatic. Prosecuting them would have required acknowledging that the state had created the conditions for their actions. It would have opened the door to lawsuits, reparations, and a national reckoning that the post-communist government was unwilling to pursue. So instead, the survivors were classified as victims. Their participation was deemed the result of coercion, and the question of their culpability was quietly set aside. This decision brought relief to some survivors. But it also left others with no way to process their guilt, because without accountability there can be no redemption, and without redemption there is only the weight of what was done, carried in silence until death. One of Turcanu's former associates, speaking anonymously decades later, said, "People ask me if I feel guilty. Of course I do. Every day I feel guilty. But guilt is not the hardest part. The hardest part is knowing that I became exactly what the system wanted me to become, and I can never undo that. I can never go back to who I was before. That person is dead, and I killed him." The legacy of Pitești's perpetrators is not one of justice or redemption. It is a legacy of unresolved trauma, buried shame, and a question that Romania, like many countries that have faced similar reckonings, has never fully answered. How do you hold people accountable for crimes they committed while being systematically broken? The answer for most survivors was simply to stop asking. Because asking required confronting a truth too painful to bear, that the line between victim and perpetrator is not always clear, and that in the right circumstances, almost anyone can be made to cross it. When the Pitești program ended in 1952, the survivors were not freed. They were transferred. Some went to labor camps, others to different prisons. A few were released, but under constant Securitate surveillance. None of them returned to the lives they had left behind, because the person who had entered Pitești was not the person who walked out. Those who were released faced a world that had moved on without them. Families had been told they were dead or had disappeared. Jobs had been filled. Friends had forgotten them or been too afraid to associate with former political prisoners. Reintegration was not just difficult, it was impossible. One survivor described returning home after 4 years. "My mother opened the door and didn't recognize me, not because I looked different, though I did, but because something in my eyes had changed. She said later that it was like I had died and someone else had come back wearing my face. The psychological damage was profound and permanent. Many survivors experienced what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness. But in 1950s Romania, there was no such diagnosis, no therapy, no support systems. There was only the expectation that you would return to normal. And when you couldn't, you were left to manage it alone. One survivor attempted to explain what it was like. "You learn to live in constant fear, not of something specific, just fear itself, a baseline state you can never escape. You flinch at raised voices. You can't sleep in the dark. You can't form attachments because you've learned that attachments are weapons people use against you. You exist, but you don't live." Some survivors tried to build new lives. They changed their names, moved to different cities, avoided anything that might connect them to their past. A few succeeded. They found work, started families, and created a fragile semblance of normalcy. But the past never fully released them. One survivor, speaking decades later, said, "I had a wife, children, a job. From the outside, I looked like everyone else. But inside, I was still in that cell. I never left. Every interaction felt like a performance. I was pretending to be human, but I didn't remember how to actually be one." Others could not manage even that fragile pretense. They withdrew completely, unable to work, unable to form relationships, unable to participate in society. Some lived in poverty, surviving on minimal pensions, isolated and forgotten. A few became homeless, their minds too fractured to navigate the bureaucracy required for housing assistance. And some simply disappeared. No records, no obituaries, no acknowledgement that they had ever existed. The state that had broken them showed no interest in repairing the damage. The survivors who had become perpetrators carried an additional burden: guilt. They could not speak about what had happened without revealing their own participation. And revealing their participation meant admitting not just that they had been victims, but that they had inflicted the same suffering on others. One former perpetrator described it this way: "I wanted to tell someone, my wife, my priest, Anyone? But how do you say it? How do you explain that you beat a man until he lost consciousness, that you participated in his humiliation, that you became the thing you had once feared? There are no words, and even if there were, who would understand? A few survivors found limited relief through religion. They returned to the Orthodox Church, seeking forgiveness, seeking meaning, seeking some way to reconcile what had been done to them and what they had done. But even there, the path was difficult. Priests who had not experienced Pitesti struggled to comprehend the moral complexity. Forgiveness required confession. But confession required articulating acts that defied articulation. And absolution, even when offered, could not undo the internal damage. One survivor said, "The priest told me God had forgiven me. I believed him, but I could not forgive myself. And that made all the difference." In the decades after Pitești, a small number of survivors formed informal support networks. They met quietly, in private homes, and spoke about things they could not say to anyone else. These meetings were not therapy. There was no trained professional, no structured process. They were simply spaces where survivors could acknowledge what had happened without fear of judgment or disbelief. One participant described these gatherings. "We didn't talk much. Mostly we just sat together. But being in the same room with people who understood, who had lived it, that was enough. It didn't heal us, but it made the burden lighter." Many survivors did not live long after their release. The physical and psychological toll shortened lifespans significantly. Some died from untreated illnesses contracted in prison. Others from stress-related conditions, heart attacks, strokes, chronic pain, and a significant number from suicide. The official records, when they exist, rarely list suicide as the cause of death. But families knew, and the other survivors knew, because the decision to stop enduring was one they all understood. By the time the communist regime fell in 1989, most of the Pitesti survivors were elderly or already dead. The exposure of the program came too late for justice, too late for reparations, too late for meaningful acknowledgement. What they received instead was belated recognition, a government commission, a few memorials, the occasional documentary. But recognition is not restitution. And for most survivors, it was not enough. One survivor, interviewed in the final years of his life, was asked what he wanted people to remember about Pitesti. He thought for a long time before answering. "Remember that it happened. Remember that it was real. And remember that the people it destroyed were not abstract victims. They were students, sons, fathers, human beings with names and histories and futures that were stolen from them. Don't let us become statistics. That's all I ask." He died 6 months later. His obituary mentioned only that he had been a teacher before his arrest. It did not mention Pitesti. When Romania's communist regime collapsed in December 1989, there was hope, among survivors, historians, and human rights advocates, that the country would finally confront the atrocities committed in places like Pitesti. That hope was not realized. The post-communist government faced an impossible dilemma. Holding the old regime accountable would require prosecuting thousands of officials, many of whom had integrated into the new system. It would require opening archives that implicated not just communists, but collaborators across every sector of society. And it would require a national reckoning that the fragile democracy was not prepared to undertake. So instead, Romania chose a path of selective memory. Some crimes were acknowledged, others were quietly buried, and Pitesti fell somewhere in between, documented but not prosecuted, memorialized but not repaired. In 1993, the Romanian government established the Presidential Commission for the Analysis of the Communist Dictatorship in Romania. The commission's mandate was to investigate human rights abuses under communism and produce a comprehensive report. The Pitești Experiment was included in that investigation. Survivors were interviewed, declassified documents were reviewed, expert testimony was gathered. The Commission's report, published in 2006, was unequivocal. The Pitesti phenomenon represents one of the most abominable experiments in the destruction of human personality ever conducted under a political regime. The report confirmed. The program was sanctioned by the Romanian Communist Party. It constituted crimes against humanity. Hundreds of prisoners were subjected to systematic psychological and physical torture. The methods used were designed to erase identity and create obedient subjects. The program left survivors with permanent psychological damage. The report recommended official apologies to survivors, financial compensation, memorialization, educational programs to ensure the history was not forgotten, but recommendations are not actions. The official apology came in 2010, 58 years after the program ended. By then, most survivors were dead. The apology was brief, delivered in a government ceremony attended by fewer than 20 people. It acknowledged that grave injustices had occurred at Pitești, but it stopped short of naming individuals responsible or committing to prosecutions. Financial compensation was offered, small pensions for survivors or their families. But the amounts were modest, and the bureaucratic process to claim them was complex. Many families, unaware of the program or too ashamed to pursue it, never applied. Memorialization was equally limited. A small plaque was placed outside the former prison in 2014. It reads, "In memory of the victims of communist repression who suffered at Pitești Prison, 1949 to 1952. No names, no details, just a vague acknowledgement. Inside the building, which now houses a local museum, there is a single room dedicated to the Pitești Experiment. It contains a few photographs, a brief description, and some testimonies from survivors. Visitors are rare. Most Romanians still do not know the story. The absence of prosecutions remains the most glaring gap. Unlike other post-communist countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, East Germany, Romania did not pursue widespread prosecutions of officials responsible for human rights abuses. The reasons were practical and political. 1. Continuity. Many former communist officials remained in positions of power. Prosecuting them would destabilize the government. 2. Complexity. Proving individual culpability for systemic crimes was legally difficult. 3. Amnesia. Much of Romanian society wanted to move forward, not revisit the past. 4. Complicity. Acknowledging the full scope of Pitești would require confronting how many ordinary Romanians had participated as informants, guards, administrators, or silent witnesses. And that was a reckoning the country was unwilling to pursue. For survivors, the lack of accountability was devastating. One survivor, speaking in 2012, said, "They apologized, they gave us plaques, they wrote reports, but they did not give us justice. They did not hold anyone accountable. They did not even name the people who ordered this. They acknowledged the crime, but they protected the criminals. What kind of reckoning is that?" Another said simply, "An apology without accountability is just words, and words don't bring back the dead. They don't repair broken minds. They don't give us back the decades we lost." The survivors who had participated as perpetrators faced a different kind of absence. Because they were classified as victims under the law, they were not held accountable for their actions. But that legal absolution did not translate into psychological relief. One former perpetrator said, "The state said I was not guilty. But I know what I did. I know whose face I struck. I know whose spirit I helped break. The state can call me a victim, but I know I was also a perpetrator. And there is no court that can resolve that contradiction." In 2016, the Romanian Parliament passed a law criminalizing the denial or justification of communist-era crimes. It was a symbolic gesture, rarely enforced, but intended to establish a moral boundary. But for survivors of Pitești, symbols were not enough. They wanted trials. They wanted names. They wanted the officials who had authorized the program, or their successors, to publicly acknowledge what had been done and why. They wanted, in short, a reckoning. And they did not get one. By 2020, nearly all the survivors of Pitesti were dead. The last known survivor, a man named Ion Ioanid, died in 2021 at the age of 94. He had spent his final years advocating for recognition, for education, for acknowledgement. In one of his final interviews he said, "I survived, Pitești, but I did not survive to see justice. I survived to see my country move on as if it never happened, and that, in its own way, is a second kind of torture." The reckoning that never came is not unique to Romania. It follows a pattern seen in many post-authoritarian societies: partial acknowledgement, symbolic gestures, and a collective decision that forgetting is easier than confronting. But forgetting has consequences. Because when atrocities are not fully reckoned with, the mechanisms that enabled them remain intact. The structures of power, the incentives for complicity, the capacity for ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty. These do not disappear simply because a regime falls. They wait. And history, as survivors of Pitești understood, has a way of repeating itself when its lessons are left. The buildings of Pitești Prison still stand. Grey stone walls, barred windows, a courtyard where men once knelt in forced confessions. The cells have been emptied, the interrogation rooms repurposed, the corridors cleaned, but the place itself carries a weight that no renovation can erase. Visitors who walk through it describe the same feeling, a heaviness in the air, a silence that feels deliberate, as if the walls themselves are holding something back. You can empty a building, but you cannot empty its history. The legacy of Pitești extends far beyond the physical site. It forces questions that no society wants to answer, but every society must eventually confront. What are the limits of human endurance? What happens when survival requires complicity? How do you assign responsibility when victims are forced to become perpetrators? And what does it mean to survive something that destroys the person you were? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions survivors of Pitești lived with every day for the rest of their lives. And they are questions that remain relevant wherever systems of power seek to break human beings rather than hold them. Pitești was not an isolated experiment. Similar programs existed in the Soviet Union, in China during the Cultural Revolution, in North Korea's re-education camps. The methods varied. The goals were the same: to erase identity, to create obedience, to turn human beings into instruments of the state. What made Pitești unique was not the cruelty, though it was extreme. It was the systematic conversion of victims into perpetrators. The program did not just destroy individuals. It created a self-sustaining cycle of violence, where each generation of victims became the next generation of torturers. This was not a flaw in the system. It was the system's most efficient feature. The psychological mechanisms used at Pitești have been studied extensively by researchers in trauma, coercion, and totalitarianism. What they found confirms what survivors described. 1. Identity destruction. By forcing prisoners to denounce everything they believed, the program systematically dismantled their sense of self. 2. Moral inversion. By forcing victims to harm others, the program created cognitive dissonance so severe that many survivors could never reconcile it. 3. Perpetrator psychology. By rewarding participation and punishing resistance, the program turned survival into complicity. 4. Social fracture. By making every prisoner a potential informant or torturer, the program destroyed trust, the foundation of human community. These mechanisms are not unique to Pitești. They appear in varying forms, in cults, in abusive institutions, in authoritarian regimes. Understanding them is essential, not to explain away responsibility, but to recognize how systems create conditions where ordinary people commit extraordinary harm. Romania's failure to fully reckon with Pitești has had consequences. 1. Historical amnesia. Most young Romanians do not know the story. It is not taught in schools, it is not discussed publicly. It remains a footnote in history textbooks. 2. Unresolved trauma. The psychological damage extends beyond survivors. Their families, their children, carry the weight of untold stories and unexplained absences. 3. Institutional continuity. Some of the structures that enabled Pitesti, networks of complicity, bureaucratic mechanisms of repression, were never fully dismantled. They adapted, but they did not disappear. 4. Moral ambiguity. Without a clear reckoning, Romanian society remains divided on how to understand Pitesti. Was it an aberration or a logical extension of totalitarianism? Were the perpetrators victims or criminals? These questions remain unresolved. Survivors of Pitești spent their lives warning that what happened to them could happen again, not in the same form, not with the same methods, but the underlying conditions, fear, isolation, the erosion of individual rights, the belief that the ends justify the means, these conditions can re-emerge anywhere. One survivor said, "People think Pitesti was possible because of communism, but communism was just the context. The mechanism, fear, coercion, the destruction of identity, that mechanism exists wherever power is unchecked and human dignity is expendable." The story of Bogdan Petrescu is not unique. Hundreds of men experienced variations of his journey: arrest, torture, transformation, survival. Most of them are forgotten. Their names do not appear in memorials. Their stories are not told in documentaries. Their suffering is not commemorated. Bogdan's story remains because it represents all of them. Because he was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was simply a young man who entered a place designed to destroy him, and who made the choices necessary to survive, even when those choices cost him everything he had once been. He lived another 48 years after leaving Pitesti, but the person who walked out was not the person who had walked in. That person, the philosophy student, the son, the believer, died inside those walls. What survived was something else, something the system had created, and that is the true horror of Pitesti. Not that it killed, but that it turned human beings into hollow versions of themselves, capable of functioning but incapable of living. The shadow of Pitesti endures because the questions it raises have not been answered, because the systems that enabled it have not been fully dismantled, because the survivors who carried its weight are now gone and their warnings are fading into history, and because every generation must learn anew that the line between civilization and cruelty is thinner than we want to believe. Pitești was not an anomaly. It was a warning. And warnings, when ignored, become prophecies. This is where the story ends, not with justice, not with resolution, but with a question that remains unanswered. What do we owe to those who survived the unspeakable? And more importantly, what do we owe to those who did not?